All right, our next storyteller is Lawrence Witherspoon. He has an impressive resume that led him to be the director of the Center for Family Voice at Groundwork, Ohio, where he leads the center's work to elevate the voices of families with young children in early childhood policy and advocacy to achieve programmatic, policy, and practice changes at local, regional, and state levels. It includes 14 years of child welfare experience and its extensive experience in the diversity and inclusion space. He developed a financial literacy program, provides group and individual counseling support as a certified mental health and emotional intelligence specialist. He is a licensed minister, and in 2018, he established Greater Love Outreach Ministries, a non-denominational ministry with a central focus on outreach for the community, which is all really impressive. But what actually impressed me most about Lawrence is his openness to learning something new. Lawrence is a public speaker. He knows how to give a speech. He doesn't need a story coach. And yet he joined every class with enthusiasm. He encouraged his classmates, and he participated. And he shared his internal process and his revelations about his process with the group. My father would call Lawrence a servant leader. He is the type of leader that, instead of assuming that he knows what is best, he listens, he supports, he adjusts, and he advocates. Lawrence, your grandmother would be so proud if she could see you today. Let's give our final storyteller, Lawrence Witherspoon, a huge round of applause.
Bear with me. I didn't know you were going to say that. Wow. I enjoyed, and I think I received a lot from this experience. I'm sharing a story that has never really been told to the public, and I am emotional right now about this because sharing my grandmother's story is significant for me. It is significant for my family, and I just find it a privilege and a blessing to be able to share my grandmother's experience and what I've experienced with my grandmother. So thank you again for this opportunity to be able to share this with you. And I do appreciate the coaching. I do appreciate the coaching. And so 6 months before my grandmother's passing, she said something to me that I didn't quite understand yet. And she said, plant the seed, cultivate the seed, and watch the seed grow. She said this, and of course I didn't understand. And she was an older lady, and so when individuals tell you this, you don't not quite know when you're younger what these things mean. And my grandmother would always say, right after giving me something or some feedback, you'll understand it better by and by. She used to always say that to me. You'll understand it better by and by. And so some people called her Jean. Some people called her Aunt Jean. Her name was Eugenia Harris. But I called her grandmother. My grandmother grew up in the backwoods of Mississippi, in the Yazoo City area. And she worked in the tobacco and cotton field. And she worked many, many years in that field, filling up cotton in a bag, an 80-pound sack every day for 10 cents a day. And so my grandmother got exhausted doing that in Mississippi, and so she understood in order for our family survival to continue to exist, she would have to go somewhere else to start working to make more money for our family. And so she ended up here in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio specifically, and she got a job here cleaning at night, and she became a child care provider for women and families, single mothers specifically, and families in our community during the day. And so my grandmother continued to work, and her purpose for doing this work, the 2 jobs, was to make sure that she could send money back to our family in Mississippi to make sure that they could get here north to be able to provide for our families, for their individual families. And so my grandmother continued to work these 2 jobs, and she worked so hard, and she would send money back every month, to the point where she was able to send for all of her siblings, all of her younger siblings, to move here, along with my mother and I, from Dallas, Texas. And so my mother and I moved here, and I just remember getting off the plane, and I didn't see my grandmother when I got off the plane. And I'm like, where's my grandmother? Where's my grandmother? Because I hadn't seen her since I was 3, and at this time I was 5. And so my grandfather, her husband, picked us up from the airport, and I got home to my grandmother, and I just ran up to her. And it was interesting because when I ran up to her and I hugged her, I smelled this food, this wonderful food. And it was fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, that soul food that we always talk about. But it was something over at the table. It was pound cake. Pound cake. And if you've ever had pound cake, you have not had pound cake like my grandmother's pound cake. Her pound cake was phenomenal. And I just remember sitting in the kitchen. I remember eating this meal, and it seemed like every meal that we ate was like Sunday dinner at my grandmother's house. I mean, breakfast was full, lunch was full, and of course that evening dinner. And so after we got done eating, I noticed that people were knocking on the door of my grandmother's home. And I'm like, Grandma, there's somebody at the door. And she would go to the door and hand them a plate of food. And then she would sit down, and then someone else would knock on the door, and she would go give them a plate of food. And so finally I said, Grandma, why are these people showing up to the house to get food? And she said, I am planting seeds. I am planting seeds. And I had to think about that. My grandmother was feeding the community. Not only was she my grandmother, she was the grandmother to the entire community. And so eventually, those 2 jobs became a lot for my grandmother. And so she really pulled away from the cleaning job and focused more in on providing childcare for our community. But eventually my grandmother ran into some issues. She no longer had the capacity to provide childcare services for every family that needed it in our community. And so because she no longer had the capacity to do so, my grandmother started advocating in our local church. And in our local church, she held a meeting, and everyone showed up. When my grandmother speaks, everyone showed up. And so she had the entire community there, and my grandmother started advocating for assistance with child care provisions for all these families who needed affordable child care. And so I don't know how my grandmother did it, but the next thing you know, about a month and a half later, people were being taught on how to be child care providers in that ministry that reside within our neighborhood. And my grandmother became kind of like the first director of that child care facility. And so no educational background in this, but my grandmother loved children and families, and so she did what she had to do to make sure that the needs were met. And so eventually my grandmother got up in age, and she was no longer able to be a child care provider. She was no longer able to go out and see how things were going. But the entire community had child care provisions because my grandmother advocated for that through the ministry that resided in our neighborhood. And so over time, my grandmother no longer was able to really care for anyone. But it was interesting as I got older and I would stop by my grandmother's house to get that fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and collard greens. That there were other people who had grown up now, who my grandmother provided child care for, who were coming in and they were bringing gifts to my grandmother. They were bringing their own fried chicken, their own macaroni and cheese, their own pound cake to my grandmother, just showing love and appreciation for helping them grow up and providing them secure child care. And it was just at that point I realized that my grandmother not just planted a seed, but she cultivated seeds. And so I started to understand as I look back at the story and look at what my grandmother had done, that what these statements meant 6 months before her passing. And so with all that, I watched my grandmother start to demise. And I realized that looking at her, she provided a blueprint for me. And a lot of times we're always trying to figure out what our purpose is. What is it we want to do in life? What is it that we were designed to do? And I realized that my grandmother provided the blueprint for me. And I went to school for something completely detached from childcare, from child welfare. And what I realized was watching my grandmother, and as I look back at the work that she's done, she provided this opportunity for me to give back to my community, to give back to those who are in need. And it resonated with me so much, and I didn't even realize, by the time I realized that I had already started the work. And now, because of everything that my grandmother has done and her pivotal role in our community providing childcare, I am now going into 15 years in child welfare, early education, advocacy, and policy. And I am just grateful to Groundwork that allowed me an opportunity to continue my grandmother's work and her vision to do this work. And now I am no longer wondering what my purpose is. I'm living in my purpose. So I encourage you all to plant seeds, cultivate seeds, and take a step back and watch them grow. Thank you.